Canada's landscape is beautiful, but it's rugged, and our winters are kind of tough. The people who settled this country, canoeing up those rushing rivers past those twisted pines, portaging through muskeg, getting across Alberta's Great Plains, the Rocky Mountain passes, surviving at 40 below. And I'm not just talking about the Europeans. Think about the first settlers of this country, the Aboriginals come across from the Bering Strait. These people were tough as nails. They didn't have nails, but they were tough as nails. They were equal to any occasion. And the stone tools they carried included, yes, axes, bows and arrows, and spears. And if you tried to tell one of these guys, you know what, you're just not to be trusted with that thing. You're going to hurt yourself, or you're going to commit a wanton attack on someone else. You're going to have to store the shaft here and the head there. You're going to fill out a form about your intimate relations. You'd have been very lucky to get the butt end of the spear in response to that. The same thing is true of the European settlers. They were incredibly resourceful. They were brave. They were ready for anything. And yes, they too carried weapons. They carried swords. They carried flintlocks. They carried rifles. And they knew how to use them, and they knew how not to misuse them. That is the kind of people Canadians are, however they got here. And that's why they should be trusted with the tools necessary to deal with any emergency. If you talk about armed resistance to oppressive government in Canada, people are liable to suggest that you're deranged, or at the very least, distinctly un-Canadian. Sure, the British may have had to take up arms to preserve their liberty. The French may have had to fight to try and get it. And we all know the American Revolution. The battles at Lexington and Concord that triggered the American Revolutionary War happened because the British authorities were trying to confiscate the colonists' weapons in order to continue taxing them without representation, denying them jury trials, and taking their property. But that kind of thing doesn't happen here. This is Canada. Our heroes are William Lyon Mackenzie, a newspaper publisher who denounced the family compact in Upper Canada, or Louis-Joseph Papineau, who was the Speaker of the Assembly of Lower Canada and who struggled against the Chateau clique. But Papineau also founded a paramilitary organization called the Société des Fils de Liberté, and he raised an armed revolt against the British authorities because they wouldn't grant representative government in Lower Canada. And when William Lyon Mackenzie heard about what was happening here, he raised an armed revolt in Upper Canada. Yes, that's right. Right here at Saint-Denis-sur-Richelieu on November 23, 1837, the Patriotes defeated a British force. Now, 2 days later, down the Richelieu River here, or if you prefer, the Chemin des Patriotes, here in Saint-Charles, they were badly beaten and the town was burned. There were high stakes in this uprising. Now, on December 14th at Saint-Eustache, they were beaten even more decisively, and again, the town was trashed. But the rebellion didn't end. There was more action in February of 1838 and again in November of 1838, the Battle of Beauharnois. But by that point, the British had already essentially thrown in the towel. By May, the British had sent Lord Durham here to report on the causes of the uprising, knowing perfectly well what he was going to say, that it was just like the American Revolution, that free people had taken up arms to demand representative government, and the British either had to give it to them or lose the colonies. And sure enough, that's what they did. Durham actually left in late 1838, protesting colonial opposition to his policy of lenient treatment of prisoners from the revolts. But he submitted his report in January 1839, and within a decade, you had representative government in the Canadas. And it all happened because people took up arms. And it's important to note, this was not an ethnic rebellion. If you look at the names of the Patriot leaders who are celebrated, they're things like Wolford Nelson or Brown. This was an entire community that was demanding its British liberty, and when they had to do so, to demand it at the point of a musket. The Upper Canada Rebellion has a bit of a comic opera feel. The Battle of Montgomery's Tavern, there were 4 dead and 10 wounded. The Patriot War in Lower Canada was rather more serious. It went on for about a year. More than 100 people were killed. There were more than 24 executions afterward, and 58 people were deported to Australia. But the reason it didn't go on for years like the American Revolutionary War and claim thousands of lives isn't that the inhabitants of the Canadas weren't determined to have their freedom. It's that the British had learned their lesson from 1776 and gave it to them without that kind of a fight and without a formal break and declaration of independence. And the reason that we have representative government in Canada is not that we're different from the Americans. It's not that we wouldn't rise up in defense of our liberty and our right to govern ourselves. It's because we did. And that's something that we need to remember. even understanding that the likelihood of it ever happening again is minimal. Now around here they're not shy about their heritage. It's not just a matter of having the Chemin des Patriotes. There's a Patriot pizzeria, there are Patriot flags flying, there's the Patriot Soccer League, the Fountain des Patriotes, maypole celebrating Nelson. There's even a furniture maker, it's the Atelier 1837, the 1837 workshop. So yes, an armed uprising against oppressive government is very much part of our tradition. This is a celebration of a quintessentially Canadian event, the citizens taking up arms to demand their liberty and getting it. But there's another group of Canadians to whom the prospect of disarmament leading to a deprivation of other rights is all too grimly real, and that is the original inhabitants. That's underlined here at the monument to the Frog Lake Massacre that took place on April 2nd, 1885. It was carried out by Cree from Big Bear's band, led not by Big Bear but by his war chief Wandering Spirit. You see, Big Bear had signed a treaty with the Canadian government, but he didn't want to. He didn't trust the Canadian government. He warned his fellow chiefs not to sign, but after they did, the buffalo were dwindling, his people were starving, he felt he had no choice. But he thought the government was out to swindle him, and he was not wrong. After he signed the treaty, they're looking around for a place to settle on a reserve, which he didn't want to do. He didn't want his people caged in some small patch of land, deprived of their traditional lifestyle. In the meantime, they were going hungry. And when the Cree heard about Riel's rebellion and that Poundmaker was advancing on Battleford, some of them thought this is the moment. They attacked the town of Frog Lake looking for supplies, looking for arms. They took a number of people hostage, including the Indian agent Thomas Quinn, who was starving them. And they ordered the hostages to come with them to their encampment. Quinn flatly refused. They shot him through the head. At that point, things got out of hand. 8 more hostages were killed, including 2 priests. And the government cracked down. 5 of the leading organizers of the massacre were hanged. Big Bear himself was tried and convicted of treason. He went to jail for 3 years, though he wasn't involved in the massacre. He had been working to put together Cree resistance to the Canadian government. But I have to ask you, honestly, can you blame him? Was that treason to his own people? He saw that the government was disarming his people in order to cheat them. And he wasn't wrong about that. Now, I'm not justifying the massacre. It was an act of wanton cruelty, and it did their cause no good. But the fact of the matter is, if you're looking for people who understand that being disarmed is often a prelude to having your other rights taken away, look no further than the original inhabitants of this country.